Every night, after the last buzzer sounds and the lights dim at Lincoln Heights Community Center, Joe Martinez begins his shift. To most, he's just the night janitor, silently mopping floors and checking locks. But to a growing group of neighborhood kids, he's become something else. A mystery, a mentor, a legend they call the Ghost Coach. For 8 years, Joe has kept his past locked away like the old photo in his wallet. But when MichaelJordan himself shows up at a local youth tournament, Joe's quiet world is about to change forever. Sometimes the greatest games aren't played under the bright lights. They happen in empty gyms, after hours, when no one is watching, or so Joe thought. The squeak of Joe Martinez's mop against the wooden floor echoed through the empty gym. Outside, Chicago's winter wind howled, but inside the Lincoln Heights Community Center, it was just Joe and the familiar smell of pine cleaner. He checked his watch. 9:45 p.m. Almost done with another night shift. Joe moved the mop in slow, steady circles, the same way he had for the past 8 years. But his eyes weren't on the floor. They were on the basketball hoop at the far end of the court, its net swaying gently in the air from the heating vent above. "Just you and me again," he whispered to the empty gym. The sound of his voice bounced off the walls, mixing with memories of squeaking sneakers and bouncing balls that used to fill this space. During the day, kids from the neighborhood would pack the court, their shouts and laughter bringing life to the old building. But at night, it belonged to Joe. He reached the three-point line and paused, his calloused hands gripping the mop handle. The yellow shooting spot sticker he'd placed there was starting to peel. Joe bent down and pressed it back into place, his fingers lingering on the worn marker. 8 years as a janitor, but his mind still thought like a coach. Before Lincoln Heights, he'd been Mr. Martinez, head basketball coach at Roosevelt High School. For 15 years, he'd taught kids more than just how to shoot hoops. He'd taught them about discipline, teamwork, and believing in themselves. But when the school's budget got cut, his position went with it. Sometimes life gives you a different court to play on, he muttered, straightening up. Joe wheeled his cleaning cart to the supply closet, organizing the bottles and rags with the same care he once used to arrange his playbook. The closet walls were covered with old tournament brackets and newspaper clippings, yellowed with age. His eyes landed on a team photo from his coaching days, tucked behind a shelf of cleaning supplies. 15 smiling faces looked back at him. He remembered each name, each story. Tommy Rodriguez, who'd earned a college scholarship. Marcus Washington, now coaching himself. All those kids who'd needed someone to believe in them. A loud clang from the heating system made Joe jump. He chuckled at himself, shaking his head. The old building had its own language of creaks and groans, one he'd learned to understand over the years. Walking back to the court, Joe pulled his Lakers cap lower over his gray hair. The cap was worn and faded, but he wore it every night. Sue, gift from his last team at Roosevelt, before everything changed. He grabbed the basketball from his cart, the one piece of equipment that wasn't for cleaning. Every night, after finishing his work, Joe would allow himself one shot, just one, a small reminder of who he used to be. Standing at the free throw line, Joe bounced the ball 3 times. His movements were automatic, muscle memory from thousands of demonstrations to young players. Bend the knees, elbow in, follow through. The ball arced through the air, spinning perfectly. Swish. Joe smiled as he retrieved the ball. Some things you never forget. As he put the ball away, his eyes caught the gleam of trophies in the display case near the entrance. Lincoln Heights had once been a powerhouse in youth basketball, but these days, the case collected more dust than awards. Budget cuts had hit here too. No money for proper coaching or equipment. He'd seen kids practicing on the court during the day, their form all wrong, their talent going to waste. Sometimes his hands itched to show them the correct way to set, their feet, how to square their shoulders. But he kept quiet. He wasn't a coach anymore. Joe clicked off the main lights, leaving only the security lamps glowing. The gym took on a different character in this light, shadows stretching across the court like players frozen in mid-game. From his pocket, he pulled out an old leather wallet. Inside, behind his ID card, was a folded photograph he'd carried for 40 years. He didn't need to look at it anymore. Every detail was burned into his memory. But some nights, like tonight, he felt its presence more strongly. A sharp bang from the hallway snapped Joe's attention away from the wallet. Probably just the old pipes acting up again, but he'd better check. In this neighborhood, you couldn't be too careful. He walked toward the sound, his footsteps silent from years of wearing soft-soled shoes. The hallway was dark except for the emergency lights, casting a dim glow. Joe reached for his flashlight. Another sound echoed through the building. Different this time. Not the pipes or the heating system. This sound was familiar to Joe's ears, the distinctive bounce of a basketball. Joe froze, listening. There it was again. Someone was in the building. He should call security. That's what the manual said to do. But something made him hesitate. That rhythm. It wasn't random. Whoever was bouncing that ball knew what they were doing. Slowly, Joe turned back toward the gym. The security lights cast long shadows across the court, but they couldn't hide the truth from his trained eye. Someone had been practicing here after hours, leaving subtle signs he'd been too distracted to notice before. Scuff marks on the floor that weren't there yesterday. The slightly crooked position of the ball rack. For the first time in 8 years, Joe Martinez felt something stir inside him, something he'd tried to forget, the instinct of a coach. As he stood in the darkened doorway, the mysterious bouncing sound grew louder. Joe's hand tightened around his flashlight as he faced a decision that would change everything. Sometimes life gives you a different court to play on, and sometimes it brings the game back to you when you least expect it. The bounce echoed again, closer now. Joe took a deep breath and made his choice. Joe flicked off his flashlight and pressed himself against the wall. The bouncing grew louder, accompanied now by the soft squeak of sneakers on wood. Whoever was in his gym knew how to move quietly, but not quietly enough for ears that had spent decades around basketball courts. A shadow passed through the security lights. Joe caught a glimpse of a tall, skinny figure, probably no more than 14 or 15 years old. The boy's movements were raw but natural, the kind of pure talent that made Joe's old coaching instincts tingle. The kid dribbled to the three-point line, right over Joe's freshly mopped floor, and took a shot. The ball hit the rim with a clang that echoed through the empty gym. The boy muttered something under his breath and chased down the rebound. Joe should stop this right now. Call security. Report the break-in. That's what any responsible janitor would do. Instead, he found himself watching. The boy's form was all wrong. His elbow stuck out like a chicken wing, and his feet weren't square to the basket. But there was something in the way he moved, an intensity that reminded Joe of another young player from long ago. The kid tried again. Another miss, and another. But he kept going, chasing down each rebound, putting up shot after shot in the dim light. His determination was written in every movement. Finally, Joe cleared his throat. The boy spun around, the ball dropping from his hands. His eyes went wide with fear as he spotted Joe in the doorway. "I'm sorry." The words tumbled out in a panic. Please don't call the cops. I'll leave right now. I needed somewhere to practice, and I saw the door wasn't locked all the way, and... What's your name, son? Joe's voice was quiet but firm. The boy hesitated, probably wondering if he should make a run for it. Marcus, he finally said. Marcus Thompson. Joe nodded slowly, studying the boy's face. Dark circles under his eyes suggested late nights weren't unusual for him. His clothes were worn but clean, his sneakers practically falling apart but carefully tied. You know this is breaking and entering, right, Marcus? Marcus's shoulders slumped. Yes, sir. I'm really sorry. It's just... There's nowhere else to practice. The park's not safe at night, and during the day, the older guys never let us use the court. Joe walked over and picked up the basketball, feeling its familiar weight in his hands. How long have you been sneaking in here? About 2 weeks, Marcus admitted. I found out the side door doesn't latch properly if you jiggle it just right. He quickly added, I never took anything. I just wanted to practice. My school team has tryouts next month, and I need to get better. Joe bounced the ball once, the sound sharp in the quiet gym. Your form needs work, Marcus blinked, surprised by the comment. What? Your shooting form, your elbows way off, and your feet aren't set right. That's why you're missing. How do you know about show me your shot again? Joe interrupted, passing him the ball. Marcus caught it automatically, then stood frozen for a moment, confusion written across his face. But the ball in his hands seemed to override his uncertainty. He dribbled twice, then took his stance at the three-point line. Joe watched every detail. Stop right there, he said, just before Marcus released. He walked over and stood beside the boy. Turn your right foot about 2 inches to the left. Now bring that elbow in. It should be under the ball, not beside it. Marcus adjusted his position. Better. Now try it. The ball left Marcus's hands with a smoother arc this time. It caught the backboard at the perfect angle and dropped through the net with a satisfying swish. Marcus's face lit up. How did you... 8 years as a janitor, Joe said, cutting him off again. You see a lot of basketball watching from the sidelines. He paused, considering his next words carefully. We need to talk about consequences, Marcus. The boy's excitement faded, replaced by resignation. Yes, sir. Joe took a deep breath. What he was about to suggest went against every rule in the employee handbook. But sometimes, life puts you in positions where you have to choose between what's right by the rules and what's right by the heart. I'm here every night until 10, Joe said slowly. If, and this is a big if, someone happened to be practicing during that time, well, I'd need to be in the gym anyway, keeping an eye on things while I work. Marcus's eyes widened as he understood what Joe was suggesting. But, Joe continued, his voice firmer now, that someone would need to prove they deserved that trust. I'd need to see their latest report card, and their next one, and the one after that. No grades below C+, or the deal's off. And they'd need to be out of here by 10 sharp. No exceptions. You'd do that? Marcus whispered. For me? I haven't done anything yet, Joe replied. I'm just telling you how things work in my gym. Whether someone takes advantage of that information, well, that's not up to me. Marcus stood straighter, clutching the basketball tight against his chest. I can bring my report card tomorrow, and I promise I'll keep my grades up. I won't let you down, sir. Joe nodded, then held out his hand. The ball stays here. Marcus handed it over without hesitation. As he turned to leave, he stopped at the door. Mr. Martinez, Joe said, but in here, just call me Joe. After Marcus left, Joe stood alone in the gym, the basketball still in his hands. He thought about the photo in his wallet, about chances given and chances taken, about how some things In life, come full circle. Walking to his cart, he pulled out his mop. The floor needed another going over after all that practice. As he worked, Joe found himself mentally reviewing shooting drills he hadn't thought about in years. Just before leaving that night, he placed a small piece of tape on the three-point line, marking the spot where Marcus's foot should be. Sometimes, the smallest marks can point the way to the biggest changes. That night, as Joe lay in bed staring at his ceiling, he wondered if he'd made the right choice. The photo from his wallet sat on his nightstand, its edges worn smooth from decades of handling. In the dim light, the faces seemed to watch him, waiting to see what he would do next. 8 years of keeping to himself, of being just the janitor who mopped the floors and changed the light bulbs. 8 years of watching from the shadows as talent went to waste. 8 years of carrying that photo as a reminder of what basketball could mean in a young person's life. Maybe it was time to step back into the light, even if it was only for one kid, only in the quiet hours of the night. Joe rolled over and closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. In his mind, he was already planning tomorrow's lesson. The next evening, Joe arrived at Lincoln Heights earlier than usual. His cleaning cart held something new alongside the mops and sprays. A roll of blue painter's tape that wouldn't damage the floor. He worked quickly, placing small strips of tape in specific spots around the court. One marked the perfect pivot point for a jump shot. Another showed where to position for a proper bank shot. Each piece of tape had a purpose, a lesson written in a language only a basketball player would understand. "Hope you're a good student, Marcus," he muttered, stepping back to survey his work. When Marcus arrived at 8:30, right on schedule, he was carrying more than just his worn backpack. In his hand was a slightly crumpled paper, his report card. "Here," Marcus said, thrusting it toward Joe. His eyes were fixed on the floor, already noticing the blue marks scattered across the court. Joe took the report card, noting the mix of B's and C+. Not perfect, but the kid was trying. "These grades tell me you can follow instructions," he said, handing it back. "Let's see if that's true on the court, too." Marcus looked at the blue tape pieces. "What are these for?" Joe pretended to focus on his mopping. "Looks like someone's been leaving training markers. Must be the day shift trying something new." A small smile tugged at Marcus's lips as he caught on to the game. He started his warm-up routine, and Joe noticed he was already incorporating yesterday's shooting tips. As Marcus practiced, Joe went about his cleaning duties, occasionally pausing to watch from the corner of his eye. The boy would stop at each tape mark, studying it, testing different positions until he figured out why it was placed there. After about an hour, Joe heard quick footsteps in the hallway. Marcus tensed, but Joe held up a calming hand. Around the corner came 2 more boys, about Marcus's age. "Yo, Marcus," called the taller one. "We saw you come in here and—" "Oh." They stopped short when they spotted Joe. "It's okay," Marcus said quickly. "This is Joe. He's cool." He turned to Joe. "These are my friends, DeAndre and Tyson. They wanted to practice too." Joe looked at the new boys. DeAndre was tall and lanky, built like a natural forward. Tyson was shorter, but had the quick, alert eyes of a point guard. "Your grades good?" Joe asked them. They exchanged confused looks until Marcus explained about the report card rule. Both boys immediately dug into their backpacks, producing their own somewhat wrinkled progress reports. Joe made a show of studying the papers while hiding his smile. These kids were hungry to learn. He could see it in their eyes. "Same rules apply," he said finally. "Out by 10. No exceptions." As the boys started practicing together, Joe noticed something interesting. They naturally fell into teaching each other, with Marcus explaining the meaning behind each tape mark as they discovered it. "See? If you stand here," Marcus was saying, pointing to a mark near the free throw line, "your shot lines up perfect with the backboard." Joe kept mopping, moving in slow circles around the court. Every now and then, he'd pause near a group of tape marks and adjust them slightly, adding new layers to the silent lesson. The boys picked up on each adjustment, testing and retesting until they got it right. Their excited whispers echoed through the gym. "Try it from here." "No, turn your foot more." "That's it, swish." At 9:45, Joe cleared his throat loudly. The boys immediately started gathering their things, understanding the signal. "Thanks, Joe," Marcus said softly as they headed out. The other two nodded eagerly in agreement. After they left, Joe sat down on the bleachers, his knees creaking slightly. He pulled out his wallet and the old photo. The faces smiled back at him, and for the first time in years, he smiled back. That night became the new pattern. Joe would arrive early to set up the night's lesson, marking the court with new challenges and techniques. The boys would practice until 10, teaching each other what they discovered. Joe would watch silently as he worked, making small adjustments to the tape marks when needed. Word spread quietly through the neighborhood. A week later, 2 more boys joined the group, then 3 girls who played for their middle school team. Each new player brought their report card without being asked. Joe never directly coached them. He'd just clean and maintain the gym, occasionally repositioning his tape marks. But his trained eye caught everything: the improving form, the growing confidence, the natural leaders emerging among the group. One night, as he was setting up the tape marks, he found himself humming an old tune, something he used to sing during practice at Roosevelt High. He caught his reflection in the gym's window and saw something he hadn't seen in a long time: the hint of a smile on his face. The door creaked open behind him. Joe quickly straightened up, going back to his mopping. But before the kids started their practice, he heard Marcus say something that made his heart skip a beat. "You know, my brother says he remembers a coach at Roosevelt High who used to teach these same drills. A Coach Martinez." Joe kept his eyes on his mop, but his hands had started trembling slightly. "Really?" DeAndre's voice. "You think?" "Nah," Marcus replied after a pause. "Must be a coincidence." Joe waited until they were absorbed in their practice before wiping his eyes with his sleeve. He pulled out his wallet again, looking at the photo that had been his only companion for so many years. But now, watching these kids play in his gym, he realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. Even if they didn't know it, these kids had become his team. A sharp pain in his chest reminded him why he'd stopped coaching in the first place. The doctor's words from 8 years ago echoed in his mind. "Your heart can't take the stress anymore, Joe. You need to find something quieter." He touched his chest, where the scar was hidden under his shirt. Being a janitor was supposed to be his quiet retirement, safe, simple. But as he watched Marcus nail another perfect shot from one of his tape marks, Joe knew he'd made the right choice. Some things were worth the risk. He just hoped his heart could handle what was coming. The next afternoon, Joe sat in his small apartment, staring at the pill bottles lined up on his kitchen table. The doctor's words from his checkup that morning still rang in his ears. "Your blood pressure's up, Joe. Are you sure you're not doing anything stressful?" He'd lied, of course, said he was just having trouble sleeping. A knock at his door startled him. It was Mrs. Chen from next door, holding out a plate of dumplings. "You missed dinner again last night, Joe. Not good for your health." He accepted the plate with a smile. Mrs. Chen had appointed herself his unofficial caretaker ever since his heart surgery 8 years ago. "Just busy at work," he said. The community center? She shook her head. My grandson Kevin says strange. Things happening there at night. Says kids learning basketball from a ghost. Joe nearly dropped the plate. A ghost? Mrs. Chen nodded seriously. He begs me to let him go. Says the ghost coach is teaching them secret basketball magic. She laughed. Crazy kids. After she left, Joe sat heavily in his chair. Kevin, that must be the quiet Asian boy who'd started showing up last week. He hadn't brought a report card yet, but Joe had noticed him watching from the doorway, too shy to join in. That evening, when Joe arrived at the gym, Kevin was waiting by the door, report card clutched in his trembling hands. Straight A's, Joe said, reviewing it. Your grandmother must be proud. Kevin's eyes widened. You know my grandmother? Joe just winked and unlocked the door. Inside, he found Marcus and DeAndre already setting up the day's tape marks. They'd started coming early to help, having memorized Joe's pattern of lessons. Tonight, they were showing Tyson's little sister Maria how to mark the spots for a proper layup. The ghost coach strikes again. Joe muttered under his breath, smiling, as he began his mopping routine, but his smile faded when he heard voices in the hallway. Adult voices. He recognized one as Mr. Phillips, the center's day manager. Wearing down the floor too fast, Phillips was saying. All this extra practice. Time isn't in the budget. The kids need somewhere to play, argued a woman's voice. Have you seen how much they've improved? Lisa, you're new here, Phillips replied. When the board asks why we need new flooring 6 months early, they won't care about improvement. They'll just see dollar signs. Joe's heart thumped painfully. Lisa was the new youth coordinator who'd started last month. She must have noticed the kids' progress during day programs. The voices moved away, but the damage was done. Joe looked at the kids playing under his quiet guidance, 14 of them now, each one showing up every night with their report cards getting better and better. Marcus sank another perfect three-pointer. Did you see that, Joe? He called, out excitedly, then quickly added, I mean, Mr. Martinez, sorry. It's okay, son, Joe said softly. Just keep practicing. Later that night, after the kids had left, Joe stayed behind to check the floor. Phillips was right. The extra hours were wearing down the finish faster than normal. He ran his hand over a rough spot near the free throw line. What am I doing? He whispered to the empty gym. The pain in his chest had been getting worse, especially during the more exciting moments of practice. Last week, when Maria had finally made her first three-pointer, the pride in his heart had been both emotional and physical. But how could he stop now? Just yesterday, Marcus had shown him his latest math test, a B+ where he'd been getting Ds. DeAndre's mother had stopped him in the grocery store to ask what had gotten into her son, who now did his homework without being told. And Kevin had actually spoken up during practice, suggesting a new drill pattern. Joe pulled out his wallet, looking at the old photo. What would you do? He asked, the faces frozen in time. A noise from the storage room made him jump. He walked over to investigate and found Tyson hastily shoving something into his backpack. Tyson, what are you still doing here? The boy looked up, tears streaming down his face. Please don't be mad, Joe. I needed somewhere to sleep. Tonight. Joe's heart clenched, and not from his condition. Where are your parents? Mom's working double shifts this week. Dad's not around. Tyson wiped his eyes. Usually I stay with my cousin, but he's got his girlfriend over and I just needed somewhere quiet. Joe thought about his empty apartment, about Mrs. Chen's dumplings getting cold on his table. Come on, he said. I've got a couch and some leftovers. As they walked to Joe's apartment, Tyson carrying his backpack and Joe carrying his worry, neither spoke. But when they passed Mrs. Chen's door, she poked her head out and smiled knowingly. "I make extra dumplings," she said, "for Ghost Coach and his student." Tyson's head snapped up. "You're the Ghost Coach? The one everyone talks about?" "No, Ghost," Joe said firmly. "Just an old janitor who knows a few things about basketball. And life," Mrs. Chen added, bringing out a fresh plate of dumplings. "Joe Martinez knows much about life." That night, as Tyson slept on his couch, Joe made some calls. His old players from Roosevelt High, the ones in the photo, had gone on to do well for themselves. Tomorrow, he'd start asking about job openings for Tyson's mom, about tutoring for the kids who needed extra help, about resources for families struggling to make ends meet. A coach's job was never just about basketball. His chest hurt again, but this time he welcomed the pain. It meant his heart was still working, still caring, still in the game. A text message lit up his phone. "Meeting tomorrow about community center budget cuts. All staff required to attend." Joe set his phone down and looked at Tyson's peaceful face, at the homework spread out on his coffee table, at the photo he'd propped up next to Mrs. Chen's empty dumpling plate. Some things were worth fighting for, even with a weak heart. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, in his small apartment, with one of his players safe on his couch, Joe Martinez finally felt like a coach again. And somewhere, in the quiet hours between night and dawn, he began to form a plan. The flyer appeared on the community center bulletin board on a Tuesday morning. Chicago Youth Basketball Tournament. All teams welcome. This Saturday. Joe was mopping near the board when Marcus rushed in, pointing excitedly at the paper. "Joe, we could enter as a team. We're good enough now. I know we are." "Slow down," Joe said, glancing around to make sure nobody was within earshot. "You need an adult coach to register a team. And equipment. And uniforms." Marcus's face fell, but only for a moment. "What if we got Lisa to register us? The youth coordinator? She's always watching us play during open gym. She knows how good we are." Joe's chest tightened, and not just from his heart condition. Lisa had indeed been paying more attention lately, sometimes lingering after hours with paperwork, watching. The kids practice through the gym windows. "Please, Joe," Marcus pressed. "You wouldn't have to do anything. Lisa can be our official coach. We need to prove ourselves, show everyone what we can do." Joe leaned on his mop, thinking. The kids were ready. He knew that much. Their skills had improved dramatically over the past weeks, but competing would mean exposure, attention, questions about where they learned to play like this. "Let me think about it," he said finally. That night, after the kids had gone home, Joe sat in the empty gym, staring at the court. The blue tape marks had become fewer as the players memorized their positions, the lessons becoming part of their muscle memory. His phone buzzed, a text from Lisa. "The kids asked me to coach them in Saturday's tournament. They're surprisingly well-trained. Almost like someone's been teaching them." Joe's hands shook as he typed back. "They're natural athletes." "Whatever you say." "Ghost Coach," came the reply. The next morning, Lisa registered the Lincoln Heights youth team for the U tournament. Joe watched from his cleaning cart as the kids swarmed around her, excited to receive their hastily printed team shirts, simple white tees with Lincoln Heights written in black marker. "We look official," Kevin beamed, no longer the shy boy who'd lurked in doorways. Saturday arrived bright and crisp. Joe arrived at the hosting gym early, pretending to be there to help with maintenance. From his cart, he watched teams arrive in their matching uniforms and expensive sneakers. His kids showed up in their marker-decorated shirts and well-worn shoes, but their heads were held high. "Remember what the ghost coach taught us," he heard Marcus tell the team during warm-ups. "It's not about looking good. It's about playing smart." Their first game was against the defending champions, the Northside Eagles. Joe's heart raced as he watched his team take the court. Lisa stood on the sidelines, clipboard in hand, but everyone could see the plays were already ingrained. In the team's movements, the Eagles scored first, their coach smirking at the mismatched Lincoln Heights squad. But then Marcus caught DeAndre's eye, nodded toward one of their practiced positions, and everything changed. It was like watching a dance they'd rehearsed 1,000 times. Each player knew exactly where to be, how to move, when to pass. The Eagles coach stopped smirking as the score gap widened. "Where did they learn to play like that?" Joe heard someone in the crowd ask. "I heard they've got some kind of secret coach," another replied. Joe kept his head down, mopping the same spot over and over, his chest tight with pride and anxiety. They won that game, and the next, and the next. In the semi-finals, Joe noticed a tall figure in the shadows of the bleachers, watching intently. Something about the way the man stood, the way he studied the game, seemed familiar. The final game was against a private school team with a professional coach. Joe's hands trembled as he gripped his mop, watching his kids take their positions. The mysterious observer had moved closer to the court, still hidden in shadow. The game was close. Too close. Joe's heart pounded dangerously as he watched. With 30 seconds left, Lincoln Heights was down by 1 point. Marcus had the ball. He caught Joe's eye across the court, and in that moment, all the late-night practices, all the silent lessons, all the blue tape marks led to this. Marcus moved to the exact spot where Joe had placed his very first piece of tape all those weeks. Ego. His form was perfect. Elbow in, feet set, follow through. The ball arched through the air as the buzzer sounded. Swish. The gym erupted. Lisa jumped up and down, hugging the kids as they rushed the court. Parents and spectators cheered, but Joe stayed in his corner, tears streaming down his face. Through his tears, he saw the mysterious figure step into the light, starting to walk toward the celebrating team. Joe's heart nearly stopped. He knew that walk. He knew that presence. He'd seen it 1,000 times on TV. But before Joe could process what he was seeing, Maria's voice cut through the chaos. "Joe, something's wrong with Marcus's dad." In the stands, Mr. Thompson had collapsed, clutching his chest. Joe's own heart condition forgotten, he rushed forward, already pulling out his phone to call 911. As he ran past the mysterious figure, their eyes met for just a moment. Recognition flickered in the man's gaze, but Joe couldn't stop. His kids needed him. Some things were more important than secrets. The hospital waiting room was packed with kids in marker-decorated white t-shirts. Joe sat among them, his janitor's uniform still on, his heart medication untaken. Marcus paced back and forth, wearing the championship medal nobody felt like celebrating anymore. "He's going to be okay," Joe said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "The doctors know what they're doing." "How can you be sure?" Marcus's voice cracked. Joe touched the scar on his chest through his shirt. "Because 8 years ago, I was in the same situation, same hospital, same condition, and I'm still here." Marcus stopped pacing. "You had a heart attack too?" "That's why I had to stop coaching at Roosevelt. Doctor's orders." The words slipped out before Joe could catch them. The entire team turned to stare at him. In the heavy silence, Joe could hear his own heart pounding. "I knew it!" DeAndre jumped up. "You were Coach Martinez. My brother used to talk about you all the time." Before Joe could respond, Lisa hurried into the waiting room. "Marcus, your dad's awake. He's asking for you." As Marcus rushed off, Lisa fixed Joe with a knowing look. "Coach Martinez, huh? The one who took Roosevelt to state finals 3 years in a row?" Joe sighed. After 8 years, his secret had unraveled in a matter of minutes. "Why did you hide it?" Tyson asked softly. "Why pretend to be just a janitor?" "I never pretended," Joe replied. "I am a janitor. It's what I could still do after my heart attack. But sometimes life gives you a second chance to make a difference, even if it's not the way you planned." The kids absorbed this in silence. Outside the waiting room windows, storm clouds were gathering, matching the mood. Then Kevin spoke up, his usual shyness forgotten. "There's a man here to see you, Joe. The one from the tournament. He's been waiting." Joe's chest tightened. He'd almost forgotten about the mysterious observer in all the chaos. "Go talk to him," Lisa urged. "I'll stay with the kids." Joe found him in the hospital cafeteria, sitting alone with 2 cups of coffee. Even in the fluorescent hospital lighting, there was no mistaking who it was. "Been a long time, Joe." "MichaelJordan." Joe's voice was barely a whisper. "Sit down before you fall down, old friend." Jordan pushed one of the coffee cups forward. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Joe sat heavily, his legs weak. "How did you find you?" Jordan smiled. "I've been looking for stories like yours. Coaches who changed lives. Mentors who worked in the shadows. When I heard about a ghost coach in Chicago teaching kids the exact same drills that changed my life," he pulled out an old, folded photograph. Joe's hands trembled as he reached for his wallet, removing his own copy of the same photo. Tuaku. Identical images. A young MichaelJordan standing next to a smiling janitor on a middle school basketball court. "Mr. Wilson," they said in unison, remembering the janitor who had mentored Jordan all those years ago. "He worked nights, just like you," Jordan said softly. "Taught me everything I knew about the fundamentals. Never took credit, never asked for recognition. When I heard about what was happening at Lincoln Heights..." A commotion in the hallway interrupted them. Lisa burst into the cafeteria, her face pale. "Joe, you need to see this." She held up her phone, showing an email from the community center board. Joe had to read it twice before the words sank in. Due to budget constraints and liability concerns, Lincoln Heights Community Center will cease operations at the end of the month. The room spun. All those kids, all those late-night practices, all those dreams just starting to take flight. "No," Joe whispered. "They can't." His chest constricted painfully. He fumbled for his heart medication, but his hands were shaking too badly to open the bottle. Jordan reached over, steadying Joe's hands. "Breathe, Coach. We're not letting this end here." "But the budget," Joe gasped. "Let me worry about that." Jordan's voice had the same intensity Joe remembered from that middle school court decades ago. "You've done exactly what Mr. Wilson did for me. You showed these kids they matter, that their dreams matter. Now it's my turn to pay it forward." Joe's phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. "Dad's asking for you. Says he remembers you from Roosevelt. Says he needs to thank the man who's been teaching his son." The storm outside had broken, rain lashing against the windows. But inside, Joe felt a different kind of storm brewing, one of hope and possibility. "Michael," he started, but Jordan cut him off. "Go see Marcus's dad. We'll talk more once you've taken your medicine and gotten some rest." He stood up, that familiar competitive gleam in his eye. "Besides, I've got some calls to make. Turns out, I know a few people who might be interested in saving a community center." As Joe walked toward Mr. Thompson's room, his secret finally revealed, his chest still tight, but his heart somehow lighter. He heard Jordan call after him, "Oh, and Coach Martinez." Joe turned. "Those kids played exactly like you taught me all those years ago. Mr. Wilson would be proud." 1 month later, Joe stood in the Lincoln Heights gym, his mop forgotten in his hands. The place was packed, not just with his late-night players, but with reporters, community members, and a crowd that spilled out into the hallways. "Ready, Coach?" MichaelJordan stepped up beside him. Joe adjusted his tie, the same one he'd worn during his Roosevelt High championship games. "Not sure I'll ever get used to being called that again." "Better get used to it fast." Jordan grinned. "You've got some explaining to do." At the podium, the chairman of the Community Center Board was finishing his speech. And thanks to a generous grant from the Jordan Youth Foundation, along with matching donations from several NBA players who started in community centers like this one, Lincoln Heights will not only remain open, but will expand its youth programs. The crowd erupted in cheers. Joe saw Marcus hugging his father, who had been released from the hospital last week. Mr. Thompson caught Joe's eye and nodded gratefully. "And now," the chairman continued, "MichaelJordan would like to say a few words about why he chose Lincoln Heights." As Jordan took the podium, Joe felt a small hand slip into his. It was Maria, Tyson's little sister, clutching her tournament medal. "When I was 13, Jordan began, "I was a kid with a dream and nowhere to practice. But there was this janitor at my school, Mr. Wilson, who changed my life. He taught me basketball fundamentals after hours, never asking for credit, never seeking recognition. He just wanted to help a kid who needed guidance." Jordan pulled out the old photograph, now blown up on a poster board. "This photo was taken the day before Mr. Wilson retired. He made me promise that someday, when I could, I'd find a way to thank him by helping other kids the same way he helped me." The gym fell silent as Jordan pointed to Joe. 2 months ago, I started hearing stories about a ghost coach at Lincoln Heights. Kids were showing up to tournaments with perfect fundamentals, playing with the exact same drills Mr. Wilson taught me. So I came to watch, and you know what I found?" Jordan's voice filled with emotion. "I found Joe Martinez, a janitor who gave up his successful coaching career because of health problems, but never gave up on teaching kids. Just like Mr. Wilson, he worked in the shadows, asking nothing in return except good grades and dedication." Tears streamed down Joe's face as Jordan continued. "That's why the new Lincoln Heights Youth Center will include the Wilson Martinez Basketball Academy, a free program for any kid willing to work hard and keep their grades up. And our first head coach?" Jordan turned to Joe. "Well, I think you all know who that should be." The kids erupted in cheers. Marcus ran up and hugged Joe, followed by DeAndre, Tyson, Kevin, Maria, and all the others. Mrs. Chen, who had somehow squeezed through the crowd with her plate of dumplings, wiped her eyes with her apron. "But my heart." Joe started to protest. "Already taken care of," Lisa stepped forward, holding up a paper. "The board's insurance now covers a part-time coaching position with proper medical supervision. You're not in this alone anymore, Coach Martinez." Joe looked at his kids, because they were his kids now, officially, and saw in their faces the same hope he'd seen in young MichaelJordan's eyes all those years ago. The same hope Mr. Wilson must have seen in him. "Speech!" someone called out. Soon, the whole gym was chanting, "Speech! Speech. Joe stepped to the podium, his heart full but steady. He pulled out his wallet and took out his copy of the photograph. Mr. Wilson taught me that sometimes life's greatest victories happen after hours, when nobody's watching. That sometimes the most important coaching happens with a mop in your hand and chalk marks on the floor. That every kid deserves someone who believes in them, even if that someone's just a janitor with a dream. He looked at his players, standing, tall in their tournament shirts. You kids taught me something too. You taught me that some things are worth risking your heart for, that it's never too late for a second chance, that miracles can happen in an empty gym at 9 o'clock at night. Joe turned to Jordan. And you, Michael, you taught me that the game is bigger than any one of us, that what we pass on matters, more than what we keep. He held up his photograph next to Jordan's. Mr. Wilson never got to see what became of that skinny kid he taught in an empty gym. But I get to see what becomes of these kids, and that's the greatest gift of all. The applause was deafening. As Joe hugged his players, shook hands with parents, and accepted congratulations from reporters, he felt something he hadn't felt in 8 years: complete peace. Later that night, after the crowds had gone, Joe picked up his mop one last time. Tomorrow, he'd start his new life as Coach Martinez again. But tonight, he had one more piece of blue tape to place on the court. As he marked the same spot where Mr. Wilson had first taught a young MichaelJordan, the same spot where he'd first taught Marcus, Joe smiled. Some lessons couldn't be taught with words. Some victories couldn't be measured in points. And some heroes worked the night shift, armed with nothing but a mop and a heart full of hope. The game would go on, passed from one generation to the next, in gyms just like this one, guided by people who believed that every kid deserved a chance to dream. And somewhere, Joe knew, Mr. Wilson was smiling too. And that's the incredible story of Joe Martinez, the night shift champion. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. For another inspiring story that will move you just as much, click the video appearing on your screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.